So today we're talking about the fact that I think I3 and EYP mission critical facilities, if I got that right, you've just published a white paper, I think the first in a planned series. Can you give us a bit of an idea? I know it's, the broad topic is sustainability, but can you give us a particular sort of handle on what the white paper covers?
Okay, so this is a first in a series of papers. Currently, there's an additional 12 papers that we have planned to publish. But the purpose of the first paper is to essentially, in very broad terms, talk about the sustainable technologies that are applicable or could be applicable to data centers specifically. So there are lots of low carbon technologies on the market. There's I think a fair amount of confusion in the market about which of these technologies may be useful to data centers. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing that we talk about in that paper are new revenue opportunities associated with sustainable technologies. Because I think this is from an economic standpoint, this is a necessary topic that is new. I mean, typically data centers don't generate revenue from their standby power or energy storage system. So that's a new angle.
Okay, and in terms, I mean, before we drill down into the specifics you've talked about in the paper, it'd be good to have a little bit of thought about, I mean, when we look at sustainability, I guess there's always a balance to be struck between, clearly there's a financial angle to it, whether it's a plus or a minus, there's operational issues, and then clearly there's the environment itself. Does the paper, or do you have any thoughts as to how those three can all align, or does sometimes choices have to be made between one or the other?
Okay, so that is correct. So when you're considering the technologies, there's far more than just the technology itself that you have to look at as a data center owner. You obviously have to look at the economic upside, downside. There are many environmental factors which also play a part. So one technology may work very well in a temperate climate that may not work at all in a tropical climate. And there are also technologies which are less applicable or more applicable according to the grid, in other words, the power grid emission factor or fuel mix. So there are many factors. So the paper talks about all of these different considerations. What it doesn't do is say this is the right solution for you. It's really just saying, guys, when you're looking at this, these are all the considerations that you have to take into account, or rather should take into account when you're deciding which is the best technology for your application.
Okay, and fairly recent, I think there's this new EU carbon neutral data center pact. I think that's how they describe it. The idea being that the data centers across Europe, I guess, will be carbon neutral by 2030. Do you think, I mean, that's a laudable objective. Do you think it's achievable? Or do you think maybe, I think 2050 is more of a concrete date whereby the world has sort of decided carbon neutral is going to arrive. So how do you characterize the data centers objectives with that wider view?
Well, so yeah, as you say, it's a laudable objective, and it's to be commended. So let's be clear about that. I'm fairly clear in my own mind, and fairly frankly outspoken on this point, because if you're going to really move the needle, in my opinion, in terms of sustainability, in other words, to significantly reduce the carbon footprint of data centers, it's going to require a mandate. It's going to require government mandate. A number of people believe, and I believe wrongly, that you can simply rely on economic factors to do that. I think the issue is too important to simply rely and hope that the economic drivers are sufficient. Economic drivers or market forces are not always don't always have a positive impact. I mean, if you look at, for example, the subprime and the consequential financial crash that arose because of that arose because of the lack of regulation within the industry. So I'm not suggesting anything like that is going to happen. What I'm saying is that you need to have a rigid mandate backed by government to ensure that the objectives are met.
And just picking up on that, but do you think the industry and maybe even society more generally is ready to have that kind of mature conversation, or are we still unfortunately in the soundbite world where, for example, I also think the air industry, during lockdown, it's been great because they haven't been flying. So environmentally, that's tremendous. But clearly there's a massive pressure for them all to get back flying and making money again. But then they're going to start polluting, quite frankly, again. So do you think that kind of friction still has to be addressed in a meaningful way?
I think my sense of it is the industry as a whole is on board with doing the right thing, fundamentally. My view is that the industry is constrained by necessity by market forces as things stand, which don't necessarily coincide with the sustainability objective. Let's put it this way: if we accept the data center industry is mission critical to society, then and if we also accept that the data center industry is as it stands, a significant negative contributor to the decarbonisation. It just simply stands to reason that that the governments need, in my opinion, to step in, no matter how amenable or otherwise the data center industry might be to legislation. And I personally, I think we have enough legislation, but I wouldn't ordinarily state this, but I think in this particular case, it has to be mandated. It's just my view.
Okay, and moving on to the technologies or ideas that the white paper covers, perhaps if you can talk through a little bit about each, starting with the idea of demand side response, if we can.
Okay, so this is definitely an upside for data centers. So this is essentially now integrating the data center energy systems with the grid. So currently, as you know, the way that the data centers interact with the grid, generally speaking, is data centers take power from the grid, condition it through a UPS system, and use standby diesel generators, generally speaking, as the backup power. So essentially, there is no proper integration in the grid, in the sense that the data center does not export power to the grid and typically doesn't isolate itself from the grid when the grid has the demand issues. So the opportunity really with low carbon technologies, and you can't do this with diesel generators because they're carbon heavy, is if you look at alternative forms of generation and alternative forms of energy storage, due to their relatively low carbon footprint or emission factor, if you can integrate that with the grid, you can do two things. One is you can support the grid when the grid has a particular need, and it does. Most grids do have a need in terms of additional generation and support during frequency anomalies and so on. There's an opportunity there for the data centers to change completely in the way that they're deployed, and in the sense that they integrate with the grid and support the grid, either by injecting energy into the grid or by disconnecting from the grid when the grid has a particular surge in demand. There's a real opportunity there for data centers to draw additional income from the grid. And the thing about this is that there's absolutely nothing new about this except in the data center sense. And distributed generation has been increasing throughout the world for many years, and there are well-defined protocols and policies for the way in which these distributed systems interact with the grid. What I'm saying now is, well, guess what? Data centers have that opportunity too now, if people are prepared to take that step, which I personally think is inevitable. It's only a matter of time.
Okay, and I know, some people are reluctant to, because obviously you referenced earlier the mission critical aspect of data centers. They somehow think, maybe erroneously, that they're somehow, reducing the resilience of the facility by engaging that activities. Is that just a myth, or is there a very minor risk that, if managed properly, shouldn't become a major obstacle?
So this is one of the things that we're going to look at in a future paper, which is the reliability analysis and the availability analysis of when you introduce demand side response abilities within the data center, what that does to availability and reliability. people's concern is completely understandable. At the moment, it's all just words. So we're going to put some mathematics behind that. And I don't know what the result of that at the moment is, Phil, but I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to show these systems are as reliable, if not more reliable, than the current setup.
Okay, and then moving on, I think the next one you've referenced is data center power generation. So what's entailed in that?
We're kind of on the same subject here. So, you know, the point here being that the opportunity arises for data centers that are moving towards more sustainable solutions to look at the way in which they deploy their standby power. So currently, as you know, standby generators, and make a switch to more sustainable generation. And with that, potentially, because the generation is sustainable, there becomes this opportunity to export to the grid or use that as prime energy or primary energy to drive the data center and have the grid in reserve. And similar opportunities exist from an energy storage point of view, again, supporting the grid and also supporting the data centers, bi-directional, unidirectional microgrids, essentially.
Okay, and I know in the wider world, sort of energy storage, huge great batteries, etc., is looked as a possible way forward. Is that similar in the data centers? We're talking about ranks and ranks of batteries that they will have, and that's where the energy storage is going to happen, or is that something else we're looking at?
May well. I mean, again, the jury is out on that. There are lots of different battery technologies. There's some very interesting battery technologies which are still in development or have recently been introduced to the market. I'm not going to call them out, but there are some great examples of this. But it's not just batteries. There's other forms of energy storage that need to be considered as well. Compressed air or liquid air, kinetic energy storage. There's even nanotechnologies that could, maybe not yet, but in time be used as energy storage. But the point being, whether it's batteries, nano, compressed air, kinetic, no matter what it is, if you look at the solution and you can convince yourself that the solution is adequately robust, is cost effective, then it's a win-win. It's a win-win for the operator and it's a win-win for the grid.
Okay, then moving on to perhaps a slightly different topic. You talk, I think the paper covers sustainable energy trading. So where does that fit?
So this fits in terms of the demand side response. So the idea potentially would be for those data centers that are willing to adopt the low carbon generation or indeed energy storage solutions, the opportunity exists to coexist with the grid and trade energy back into the grid on demand as the grid calls for, whether it is short-term support in terms of frequency response, which would be a good application of, say, the battery technologies or the short-term energy storage technologies, or the longer-term generation, whether that's gas reciprocating engines or even gas turbines, could be used to support the data center and the grid on demand from the grid. And there are some big upsides financially for a data center owner if they're willing to consider that.
And in terms of that, excuse my ignorance, I mean, is there already a market for this? Is there? I'm not saying it's happens in London on the stock exchange, but is there a formalized energy trading and sustainable energy trading platform, or is that something that needs to be developed to take account of?
No, this exists already. I mean, certainly in developed countries, this is, as I mentioned earlier, in distributed generation, in other words, private generating facilities, renewable private generating facilities, have existed on the grid to support the grid for a long, long time. All the protocols are in place. Of course, it introduces a new level of complexity from an operator's point of view, but the technologies are not new. The question is, are the data center owners interested in tagging on to this as an additional income source to the income from the end users, the tenants of the data center?
Okay, and also, I mean, I guess slightly related to what you talk about, sustainable performance indices. So, I don't know what those are. So, talk me through that, please. Yeah.
Okay, so listen, I mean, so in the absence of anything else, what we need to do is look at each sustainable technology and figure out just how sustainable it is. So, there's a lot of factors that need to be looked at from a point of view of sustainability. Obviously, there is efficiency. There is the embodied energy, in other words, not the energy used associated with creating that product, but never mind the amount of energy that it uses whilst it's in production. There are things like deleterious effects. So, for example, if you look at lithium-ion, while on the face that lithium-ion has a happy face, there are some negative attributes from the point of view of the deleterious effect on the environment, and so on and so on. So the idea is to take these metrics and simply use these metrics to compare one sustainable technology to another, which should give an output, which is, there are numerous ways in which this can be done, but this is kind of our way of encapsulating and addressing the various factors that should be considered to arrive at an overall sustainability factor. That's what this is about. And
I mean, you mentioned obviously the whole life cycle it can be very difficult to actually drill down into the, environmental impact, as you say, from starting with a raw material, like wind turbines, for example. Conversation with someone recently, great technology, renewable energy, but building a wind turbine maybe not the greatest environmental, sort of situation in the world. And then what do you do with the waste metal, etc. at the end? So how easy do you think it is to categorize as the environmental footprint or whatever of a particular activity or item?
Let's be fair to wind turbines first, okay? Because you're given a bit of a hammering there. This is all relative, okay? So we've got a situation at the moment where, as we know, we have a literally untenable, unsustainable trajectory in terms of the way that we, as society, are carrying on in terms of putting more carbon dioxide and other harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So wind turbines, yes, of course, they have a carbon footprint. When you look at their carbon footprint relative to other sources of generation, they're very small, which kind of, if you don't mind, I'll bring myself onto the next topic, which is this question of, whether carbon net zero is achievable, and certainly by 2030. You've got to understand, this is about an incremental decrease and incrementally reducing or decarbonizing. It is not a question of net zero. Net zero, I mean, it reminds me of those old PUE arguments. People used to say they had a PUE better than one. We're going to be using carbon one way or another. Now, we may, through the technologies that we adopt, be able to do better things in terms of efficiency and what we do with the byproducts of generation or energy storage. There's no question about that. But really, what's being said about this is, if you look at it from a very large, I guess, holistic perspective, it's about incrementally reducing the impact that we would otherwise have. It's not really about net zero. That's just marketing hype, in my opinion.
And I've got to ask, do you have a view on, nuclear, if you're a supporter, then it's, renewable, environmentally friendly, etc., and you can really forget about maybe the waste, and obviously the sort of opponents will point out all the potential dangers, but it would appear to be an obvious way. Certainly the government would seem to think that they can just build, well, I say just because nobody wants to build them for them, but if you could build some nuclear power stations, that's clean energy. But how would you characterize nuclear power in this?
Okay, so there's actually, you mentioned that, but there's also more than talk about data centers having their own small fission plant. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? On the one hand, you only have to look at Fukushima, you only have to look at Chernobyl, and the answer is a big red cross. We're not going to do it. You don't need me to explain that to you. I think this is, unfortunately, not something you can easily quantify. On paper, nuclear has got a very much reduced emission factor from a grid standpoint. I'm not sure about whether it's right to introduce more nukes or not. I guess if you look at it purely from a carbon point of view, the answer is yes. But then there's also that other aspect of what has happened in the past that I think has to be considered. In a way, it's a bit like the deleterious effect that some of these technologies may be having on the environment as well, which don't actually count towards embodied energy, or may not count towards carbon, but the deleterious effect. So I guess it's akin to that. Sorry, I'm kind of not trying to dodge the question. It's just I don't have a clear view on it.
But that's interesting, because again, you mentioned earlier you think legislation is the way forward, and without trying to get too political, do you think this government, or indeed any other, has the wherewithal and the will to have this level of debate? Because you say, nuclear, for example, or a lot of these other things, to understand it and discuss it in a mature fashion, as opposed to sort of polarize people into, it's all bad or all good.
I don't think anything is going to be discussed until we've got empirical data. And at the moment, we don't have empirical data we need. We need this. We need to know what the data center industry is doing on country by country level in terms of its carbon impact. And let's see what the impact is. If you look at Ireland, for example, Ireland, we know, based on the statistics, data, what's being built there, what is about to be built there, has, relatively speaking, a massive data center energy footprint. But Ireland's dealing with that, in my opinion, in the right way, with the way that it's using renewable energy and embedded generation to handle the growth in their data center sector. It's difficult to say, Phil. We need those studies. We need the studies to say, right, what's the carbon damage on a country by country basis, in order to determine whether legislation is necessary. I've already stated my view.
And just sort of before we wrap up, do you think the data center industry will be willing, because I know it's notoriously difficult to research and find out accurate information about size of the data centers, numbers, etc. Do you think the industry will welcome and sort of engage in that kind of activity, or because they're a little bit on the back foot, maybe it will be difficult to uncover the exact picture?
I think it'll be incredibly difficult. I remember doing a study, I've got to be careful what I say here, let's say for a government, and the government wanted to know, this is back in the day, they wanted to know what the PUE was of all the data centers that they had, and so we went and spoke to all the data center operators, and eventually I think we ended up with about 25 data points. And of course, the data came back and everybody looked at it and said, well, that's much better than we thought it would be. But here's the problem. Only those countries that had an efficient system contributed to the survey. All the inefficient ones didn't. There's the answer.
Okay, and as we wrap up, you referenced earlier another white paper, what that was going to look at. Can you give us sort of, without maybe listing them all, but just give us some idea of the areas you're going to look at? I mean, for example, I've just been looking at water. I mean, PUE is massive, but water usage effectiveness is another one that interests me. I mean, is that one of the areas you might be covering in a future paper?
And at the moment, water usage effectiveness is not a specific topic that we're looking at. What we're looking at really are technologies, as opposed to metrics like WUE or CUE. Yep. So we're going to look at energy storage as a topic. We're going to look at hydrogen as well. We're going to look at try to quantify the financial upside and downside of demand side response for particular technologies. Of course, there's the roadmap itself. One of the things that we haven't spoken about publicly that I think we kind of zoned in at the moment is all the legacy data centers, and whether in fact it's possible, viable, to convert from standby diesel engines to, say, gas reciprocating engines. Whether that's viable, because potentially that's if it did work out, be quite a useful contributor to decarbonisation. Basically, the whole myriad of topics, sustainability-based, technology-based, with an assessment of the sustainable benefits associated with each one.
Okay, and maybe if I can, might be a bit unfair, but put you on the spot. When it comes to the whole sort of energy power debate, are you a glass half empty or Hoffel, do you think we're going to run out and it's all going to end up in a bit of a mess, or do you think if we do the right things, within the right time frame, we can look forward to a healthy future, dare I say?
Of course, we'll do the right thing. It just takes education. People just need to understand what the benefits are. Whether that's no matter what the technology. Yeah, we'll make it. Of course, we will. We'll probably do it. During the last 100 meters of a marathon. But yeah, I will make it. Anyway, but I'm an optimist. There you go.
Okay, no, that's brilliant. I really enjoyed chatting to you. So, Ed, thanks very much for your time.
All right, Phil. See you soon. Bye-bye.